Among the nobility in Orlais, custom dictated that masks were to be worn when in public. These delicately crafted works of art were painted to indicate the affluence of one's family. Some were anointed with tiny jewels laid out in tasteful patterns, while others were inlaid with silver and gold. Still others went over the top with their decorations of peacock feathers or glittering dragon scales. To have a more beautiful mask than one's rivals was seen as an advantage, and thus the empire's mask makers numbered among the most influential and sought after of its artisans. Servants wore a simpler version of the mask traditional to their master or mistress's household. A clear message to any who saw them: I am owned, and you harm me at the risk of incurring the wrath of the one I serve. To wear a mask to which you were not entitled was extremely dangerous. A wise nobleman guarded his masks like he guarded his reputation. To be without a mask in Orlais was also a statement. It said you were either a peasant, not even useful enough to be part of a noble house, or that you considered yourself above the game. To the elite, however, nobody was above the game. You were either a player or a pawn, nothing else. Justinia V, divine of the chantry and the guest of honor at the evening's festivities, was not masked, nor were the flock of priests attending her. The priesthood wasn't above the game, precisely, but an exception to it, and any nobleman was expected to maintain an unimpeachable veneer of respect when speaking to a priest, regardless of what they wore. Many priests engaged in the game even so, and some even claimed the divine was one of its best players. The priesthood simply played by different rules. Evangeline also wasn't wearing a mask. As a Templar, she technically fell under the same exemption as the priesthood. It was an exemption, however, that the nobility largely ignored. She was also the only one in the palace ballroom wearing armor and carrying a weapon. Her Templar plate had been polished to a shine, and she wore her finest red tunic, the one with the chantry starburst sewn in the gold thread. She even put her black hair up into the sort of elegant braid used by the ladies of the court. Even so, it paled in comparison to all the glittering gowns, the bouffant wigs, and their fancy combs and pearl strands, and the resplendent jewelry twinkling in the firelight, and she knew it. Evangeline knew very well that the ladies of the court who looked her way were thinking, and she knew the sorts of things they were whispering to each other behind their delicate fans. Someone as pretty as she could have found a husband. The fact that she had joined a warrior order meant she either came from a poor family or, far worse, she was too uncouth to join the ranks of proper society. None of those things were true, but it didn't matter. She wasn't there to play the game. She was there to serve as the divine's honor guard, a visible reminder to those who might use this celebration as an excuse to cause trouble. Ostensibly, the ball had been thrown by the Empress, but her Imperial Majesty was nowhere in evidence. According to everything Evangeline had been told, she was instead at the Winter Palace in far-off Halamshiral, either enjoying her latest lover's attentions, or dealing with a rebellion, depending on who you asked. Either way, it was clear the event had been arranged by palace bureaucrats, not that any of the guests seemed to mind. To show up was to prove you were worthy of an invitation, and that fact alone made it worthwhile. The ballroom was packed. The divine sat in an enormous, ornately carved wooden throne that had been brought in especially for the occasion. It was high up on a dais, providing a vantage point from which she could overlook the entire chamber. It also meant that anyone who approached her needed to do so from below. Orlesian nobles disliked being reminded of their subservience, even by someone who was unquestionably their superior, and so, once the long line of polite well-wishers earlier in the evening had ended, few chose to approach at all. Thus the guest of honor sat there in rigid silence, with only attendant priests keeping vigil at her side. She watched the throng of dancers whirl around the ballroom. Her expression kept neutral, so none could accuse her of boredom. If she felt uncomfortable in the luminous red robe and the glittering headdress, she made no indication of it. Evangeline thought the divine was the very picture of icy grace, yet most of the comments she overheard were about the woman's age. Her predecessor had held the office for almost 50 years, so long that the empire had become accustomed to the idea of a doddering and ancient divine. Now things had changed, and Some expressed a desire that Justinian V should not live to get any older. Some wanted her dead. In typical Orlesian fashion, they only spoke of this quietly, of course, and with daggers behind their backs. This was the Maker's chosen they were discussing, after all. Evangeline found their eagerness to justify such sacrilege with petty sneers and barbs almost sickening, but such was the way of the Empire. The musicians, a large troop, assembled high up in the ballroom's upper balcony, suddenly started a faster tune. Those on the floor below applauded their choice and began assembling themselves for the Tardion. It was a lively dance that had become popular ever since a recent rumor claimed the Empress favored it. The dancers lined up across from each other and assumed the posture droit. The right foot slightly in front with the weight evenly distributed. Then they began a small kick in the air with the left foot, followed by a small hop with the right, alternating until, on the fifth step, they performed a small jump back into posture. Then it all began again. All that kicking and hopping made for quite the spectacle. There was much drunken merriment on the ballroom floor, though some of the dancers clearly devoted themselves to the endeavor with practiced grace. The crowd on the sidelines clapped loudly in admiration, and even the divine and her priests joined in. As the tempo of the music increased, the pace of the dancing became frenzied. Suddenly there was a cry of alarm. A young woman spilled to the ground, tearing her skirt and taking 3 others down with her. Worse, her mask flew off and landed on the floor with a great clatter. The music ground to a halt as a murmur of interest mixed with amusement erupted. No one moved to help the young woman. She was left to scramble awkwardly to her feet, holding up the remains of her skirt as she chased after her mask. An imperious-looking woman in a towering wig of white curls, clearly her mother, ran out onto the floor to grab her arm and pull her off. The mother's face was hidden by her golden mask, but her every movement spoke of mortification rather than concern. An adept observer might have noticed that another young woman in a brilliant yellow gown had been the culprit responsible for the fall. They might have also noticed that as the musicians began a new, slower song to recover from the interruption, she moved to intercept the gentleman across from whom the fallen girl had been dancing. Truth be told, Evangeline suspected everyone present knew exactly what she had done and why. They would also quietly approve of her maneuver. The game was as merciless as it was contemptible. Evangeline kept her place in front of the divine's dais, scanning the crowd carefully. Her legs were sore from standing for so long, and the musky stench of sweat covered by sweet perfume was slowly becoming difficult to bear. Still, she had to be vigilant. The trouble with so many masks was that any one of them could be an assassin. Anyone here could be a stranger, and not a single other guest would be aware they didn't belong. She had to hope the army of guardsmen just outside the ballroom had been diligent in their duty. In the meantime, she could only wait. Another hour, perhaps, before the divine politely retired, and then her duty would be ended. Evangeline turned to see that one of the divine's attendants had approached her from the dais. This was one she'd seen before, a woman with short red hair and vividly blue eyes who carried herself in a manner so controlled and graceful that Evangeline wouldn't have been surprised to discover she wasn't a priest at all, despite her robes. A bodyguard, perhaps? It certainly made sense that the divine wouldn't trust her fate to one lone sword. Evangeline was hardly offended.
You cannot wait to get away, I'm sure.
Her Eminence need not fear that I'll abandon her.
The woman held up her hand, smiling disalarmingly.
Oh, I did not mean to imply that you might abandon the divine Justinia. You do a better job at guarding your feelings than most Templars I've encountered. Even so, this must be a very boring assignment for you.
Evangeline paused, not quite sure how to respond.
I think my Knight Commander believed I might be more comfortable in this setting, considering the family I was born to.
But you're not.
I left that life behind a long time ago.
She looked out over the crowd of dancers who were just finishing the latest song. They vigorously applauded the musicians in the gallery, and then dispersed into conversation. It was like watching a pack of wolves at work. They ferreted out the weakest of the pack, isolating them in anticipation of the kill. The only violence done, however, was with soft words and promises. The ballroom was a battleground, already littered with bodies, and yet no war was being won. At the next social gathering, this scene would play out again and again at the next, as regular as the tide.
All that wealth and influence, and what do they use it for? Their own advancement, while their world crumbles around them.
The red-haired woman seemed impressed.
I would agree with that. I know Her Eminence would as well. Pardon my manners. My name is Leliana.
I'm my Captain Evangeline.
Yes, I know. There was a great deal of discussion as to who would be guarding the Divine tonight. Many of those in your order have expressed attitudes which cause us concern.
There was a tone in the woman's voice which roused Evangeline's interest, as if there was far more to what she was saying than what she was letting on. When Leliana strode a short distance away, to a side table, and poured a glass of wine, Evangeline followed.
What do you mean? What sort of concern?
You're aware what happened in Kirkwall?
Pretty much everyone is.
Leliana gestured to the row of stately windows on the far side of the ballroom, through which the white spire was clearly visible. It was one of the few structures, beside the palace itself, which could be seen from anywhere in the capital city, and at night it was lit by magic to make it appear a brilliant sliver of white cutting across the dark, the sword of the Maker, as the Templars liked to call themselves.
The circle of Magi in Kirkwall rebelled and plunged the city into war. We've been feeling the effects across Thetis ever since. The Templars have two ways they can view it, either as a challenge to their authority, or a lesson to be learned.
I don't believe I have an opinion on the two views. I have no opinion one way or the other.
Of course you have an opinion. You said that the noble don't do anything useful with their influence. Does that mean that you feel that Templars use their influence more usefully?
Of course I do. We Templars protect the world from the mages, and protect the mages from themselves.
That sounds like you have an opinion to me.
It is one I happen to share with a lot of the Order.
That's not true. Many Templars disagree. There are many who believe a war is inevitable. They feel the Chantry has not done enough to support the Templars, and that the Chantry does not support the efforts that the Templars have made to prevent a war. They say that we need to begin picking sides.
And you're saying I was chosen by my order to protect the Divine tonight, because I've already picked a side?
It's possible. I do not know. It might be worth a discussion.
Evangeline paused, taken aback. The red-haired woman continued to drink her wine, her innocent air making it appear as if they discussed nothing of importance. Across the ballroom, another Templar entered into view. This was a young man, one of the junior members of the Order, and the sheen of sweat on his face said he'd come here quickly. He spotted Evangeline with a look of immense relief, and raced through the crowd toward her.
Sir Evangeline, thank the Maker I found you.
He stopped short as he drew near, belatedly realizing he'd interrupted their conversation. Leliana laughed lightly, not seeming the least bit offended.
There is no need to worry, Sir Knight, though I hope you have good reason for bringing your sword. There is supposed to be only one here, and it's Evangeline's.
The young Templar glanced down at his weapon, still in its sheath, and blushed with embarrassment.
I'm sorry. I didn't think. I just ran. There's an emergency.
He took a folded parchment from his tunic and handed it to Evangeline.
I was sent by the Knight Commander. There's been another murder at the White Spire.
There has.
A chill ran down Evangeline's spine as she opened the parchment. It was a note summoning her back to the tower as soon as the Divine retired for the evening. It also mentioned the Lord Seeker had taken a personal interest in this latest murder. Reading between the lines, it was clear that the Knight Commander considered this an unwelcome development.
Tell the Knight Commander that I will return as soon as I am able.
The Templar nodded, but instead of leaving, he hesitated. He stared at Leliana, chewing his lip uncertainly, and she arched a curious eyebrow in response.
I'm sorry, but I think I might have a message for you, as well.
From the Templars?
No. There was a servant looking for you. A red-haired priest. I was told there is an old friend asking to see you.
She appeared intrigued.
An old friend. Did this servant say name?
No. But the servant said the person was from Ferelden.
She turned to Evangeline and curtsied.
It seems our conversation will have to continue another time, Sarah Evangeline. Make her watch over you.
Evangeline watched the woman leave with the young Templar, and found her curiosity piqued even more than before. It was said that the divine kept agents at her side, and that some of them were bards, master manipulators of the game, sometimes spies and even assassins. If this woman was one, then their conversation had been a very dangerous one. Evangeline casually glanced around the ballroom, wondering how many people had witnessed their discussion and remarked on it. Would word get back to the Knight Commander? This was a difficult time for the Templars. The rebellion in Kirkwall had sparked unrest in every circle across Thedas, and the resulting crackdown had made things very tense. Everyone was jumping at shadows, with conspiracies seen in every corner. The White Spire was no exception. Thankfully, no one appeared to be paying her any attention. The divine was an ornament to these proceedings, as far as the Orlesian nobility was concerned, and Evangeline was a bodyguard to be paid no heed. She let out a slow breath and returned to her post in front of the dais. What she should be concerned about were the murders. Her investigation had gotten nowhere, and with the current climate, that was an unforgivable failure. With any luck, there would be more evidence this time. The ball was slowly winding down, the musicians already making their final bows and putting away their instruments. Some of the men were retiring to the palace's evening room, which was a polite way of saying they were going to drink heavily and smoke coal pipes, and otherwise engage in activities their wives wouldn't approve of. Conveniently, this left the women free to complain about the absent husbands and indulge in some matchmaking. Others were already making apologies. Those would be the ones cutting their losses, getting out before they did further damage to their reputations, even if leaving before the guest of honor would be seen as an admission of weakness. As if sensing the opportunity, the divine stood from her chair. The priest beside her stepped forward on the dais and began clapping loudly to get the crowd's attention. It was effective, and there was a general din of excited conversation as everyone assembled to hear the speech. Evangeline moved aside so as to not block anyone's view. Nodding thanks to her attendants, the divine raised her hands. She was an impressive figure in her ceremonial robes and headdress, and by rights the nobility should have been bowing low and thanking the Maker himself for having been granted the opportunity to meet his chosen, rather than treating her like just another guest with a fancy title. Naturally, those present were far too jaded, or too proud, to show such adoration, but they were willing to feign respect, and after a long moment the room was completely silent.
Honored citizens, brothers and sisters, we gather here tonight to give our thanks to the Maker, for it is by his will that we enjoy so many privileges, prosperity, freedom, an empire that stretches across half of Thedas. It is in this city that the chant of light began its journey across the four corners of the world. So it is fitting that we stop to consider our role as the Maker's favored children.
The divine paused, and with an enigmatic smile she descended from the dais. Evangeline almost choked in surprise, and the barely concealed alarm on the faces of the priests still on the dais told her this was very much unexpected. In fact, it was unheard of. Marveling whispers spread through the ballroom as her eminence approached those closest. Some backed away uncertainly, while others had the good grace to curtsy or kneel. The leaders of the chantry had always been aloof figures, rarely coming out of the grand cathedral except for state occasions. That this one agreed to come to the ball, even at the Empress's request, had been something of a surprise. There was thus no real precedent for the nobles to draw from for anything but a formal audience. She took the hand of a curtsying elderly woman in an elegant bronze dress, and the woman practically shook as she lifted her mask and kissed the divine's rings, smiling gently. The divine walked forward into the crowd. They parted readily before her. They practically recoiled, in fact, and Evangeline pictured them as a sea of hissing serpents, despite all the wigs and fancy dresses. Belatedly, she remembered her purpose and edged closer, to fall in behind the divine. Her eyes scanned over the crowd, which kept its distance, even as it pressed in. Despite the horror behind the masks, it was easy to tell their curiosity had been piqued. An advantage, perhaps, of having a younger woman wearing the holy mantle?
We should not allow fear to cloud our reason. We must remember all those who have defended us in evil times of ages past, those who allowed us our prosperity through their sacrifice. We owe them a debt, and yet we have been shamefully forgetful of that fact.
The divine paused dramatically, her eyes scanning over the hushed audience.
I speak of mages. They have helped us time and time again. Just in the Blight a decade ago, for example. The Chant of Light says magic exists to serve man, not rule over him. And so it has been. The mages have served us well in many wars over many centuries. But in times of peace, how well have we served the mages? We should mean them no harm, and yet we have harmed them time and time again.
You lie.
The cry rang out from the crowd. For a moment, it seemed as if nobody was sure who had spoken. There was a murmur of shock, and quickly the nobles parted once again as a new man stepped forward. He looked no different than many of the other noble guests, a balding yet distinguished-looking gentleman in a black velvet surcoat. When he tore off the mask, however, it revealed a face twisted by grief and rage.
You are the leader of the Chantry. You mean mages more harm than anyone. It is the Chantry that teaches people to fear us. You keep us under your thumb, reminding us that the only reason you keep us alive is because we are useful.
The people on the floor continued to back away, giving the man a wide berth until he stood practically alone with the divine, Evangeline only a few steps behind. She placed a hand on the hilt of her sword. If this man was a mage, as he claimed, that meant he was dangerous. If she drew her blade, or if the guards outside clued into the disturbance, then the divine's life could be placed in jeopardy. To her credit, the divine remained calm, raising her hands in supplication to the crowd.
Please, everyone, there is no need to be frightened. There are better ways to get an audience, I'll grant you, but I'll happily hear this man speak.
The audience twittered nervously, not entirely convinced. Neither was the mage.
You'll hear me speak only because you have to put on a public face, when in reality you have disbanded the College of Enchanters, silenced our leaders. You've done anything except hear us speak.
I'm listening, but order must be kept. If there is to be peace, it cannot be accomplished through threats and demands.
Evangeline watched the mage carefully. The man shouldn't be here. From his words, he belonged to a circle. Perhaps even the White Spire, though she didn't recognize him. But he'd clearly escaped his Templar watchers to come here. She doubted it was merely for a chat. He was trembling, seemingly only moments away from breaking down into tears. Yet his fists remained tightly clenched at his sides.
We see no peace being made. If Kirkwall was any example, it showed that nothing will be accomplished unless we fight for it.
With that, he raised his hands, and bright red power began to coalesce around him. The chamber filled with an electric charge that tickled the skin, thrumming that reverberated deep in one's skull. Magic. The dam that had kept the crowd's panic at bay suddenly broke. People screamed in alarm, and some began to rush to the ballroom doors. They pushed down whoever was in their way, trampling them if need be, and the panic gave way to cries of terror. Evangeline leapt in front of the divine. In a flash, she drew her sword and brandished it at the man. Their eyes locked, Templar and mage, the oldest of enemies.
Stand down. You know what I can do, so there is no need for this to end in bloodshed.
And where should it end? I'm dead already.
The mage extended his hands, a wide arc of flame bursting forth, and Evangeline was already moving.
Get back, your eminence,
she cried, hoping the divine would hear. She charged into the path of the fire, feeling the heat of it lick against her cheeks, and brought her sword down, into his chest. She had power of her own, the same power that all Templars shared. It was the power that all mages feared. As the blade struck him, she channeled it forth, feeling it surge through her and into her weapon. There was a bright flash as the mage's flow of mana was disrupted, his flames guttering to a halt.
Bitch!
He cried, staggering back. There was blood where his surcoat was rent. He ran his fingers in it, staring at the blood, as if shocked to see it there. Then he looked at Evangeline, his face twisting into blind hate. She rushed at the mage, realizing what he was about to do, but it was too late. The blood on his hand sizzled and evaporated as he drew mana directly from it. The blood on his chest smoked, and his eyes burned with the dark and evil power. Evangeline felt the wave of force hitting her before she reached him. She attempted to raise her aura of protection, but the magic shattered, as if it were thin glass. It knocked the breath out of her, and she felt herself flying back through the air. She crashed to the marble floor, tumbling end over end as she slid. Her head hit something hard. She lay there, the world spinning dizzily around her as she tried to push herself up. Her arms didn't seem to want to cooperate. The screams in the ballroom were deafening, seeming to come from everywhere at once. She could also hear the shouts of the guards trying to get inside, but there were too many nobles trying to push past them. Somewhere behind them, the priests were shouting, begging the divine to run. Evangeline felt a blast of heat before the flame struck her. She only barely managed to summon her aura once again, and this time it held. Even so, it buckled under the assault, and the pain as the flames seared her skin was agonizing, and she screamed. Her vision dimmed, and she felt the last vestiges of power inside her ebbing away. It might have been a moment or an hour later when Evangeline reopened her eyes. She wasn't sure. She was crouched low on the floor, her blistered hands covering her head. Her sword was gone. She must have dropped it in the fall. The air was filled with acrid smell of smoke. Something in the ballroom had caught fire, and it was quickly spreading. The panic had redoubled, reaching a fever pitch as the guests tried to get out of whatever manner they could. Someone threw a chair through one of the vaulted windows, and it shattered with a resounding crack. Then she looked up. She saw a pair of black boots. They belonged to the mage, and he was walking toward the divine. Her headdress had fallen off, but her red robes were unmistakable, even through the blaze. She had retreated to the far side of the ballroom, backed against the wall like a cornered animal. She watched the mage approach her warily, refusing to give in to terror as everyone else had. Evangeline saw the mage hold up his fist, power forming around it.
They already fear us. Now let them have a reason.
He snarled. With a great cry, Evangeline pushed herself up, gritting her teeth against the pain. She lunged toward the mage and just barely caught his surcoat. As she yanked him back, he attempted to twist around. Flailing hands sent out a gout of flame, hurtling upward. For a single moment, it seemed as if the entire ceiling was awash in ribbons of red and black, a sea of fire that roiled and bubbled as it spread. She threw the mage down to the floor hard. He snarled at her, attempting to push her away. One of his hands caught her face, as she felt his fingers digging into his eye, but she refused to be dislodged. Her gauntleted fist came down on his face once, twice, 3 times, and then something made a cracking sound. She stopped. The ballroom was still aflame, but none of it was the mage's any longer. He was still, his features twisted in a mess of blood, a vacant eye staring up at her in silent accusation. And then everything went black. When Evangeline came to, she found herself seated on the floor of the terrace just outside the ballroom. Normally, it was where the palace's guests might have come to take in the evening air, a place of tranquility, but at the moment it was pure chaos. Swarms of people milled about, some weeping on the ground, some shouting. A noblewoman in a tattered dress wandered nearby, close to hysterics, as she called out a man's name. A fat nobleman sat on the ground nearby, his expensive surcoat blackened with blood, as a guardsman tried to tend his wounds. In the distance she could spot the city guard, running into and out of the palace, desperate to restore order. How long had she been out here? Was the divine safe? It was all too much to take in, the confusion flowing around her in a sea of random voices. She tried to get to her feet, but the pain slammed into her like a fist. Gritting her teeth, she eased back down and tried to maintain consciousness. Smoke billowed out from the palace windows, and only now the fire brigade arrived with buckets in hand. With any luck, they would get the flames under control before half the palace burned down, because if that happened, the Empress might be less than impressed when she returned from Alamshirol. That was, Evangeline reminded herself, if the Empress wasn't somehow involved in the attack. Her absence the very night the mage slips into the palace to attack the divine seemed a little more than coincidental. If that were the case, there was little the Templars could do about it, but if it wasn't, someone would pay. She was racked by a spasm of coughing and her vision blurred.
Are you all right, Knight Captain?
It took several blinks before Evangeline recognized Leliana, the red-haired woman she'd spoken to earlier. She knelt down next to Evangeline, a look of sincere concern on her face.
What?
Evangeline responded dumbly, feeling as if a fog seeped through her mind. She rubbed her forehead and only belatedly noticed the blisters on her hands were gone. Her skin was whole. Leliana smiled and reassured.
There are mages here now. I had one of them heal you, but there will still be pain. You inhaled a great deal of smoke. I was worried.
I'm fine. Thank you.
Evangeline shook her head. The shouts around her were much clearer now, like the world was coming into focus.
The divine. She wasn't hurt, was she? Did she get out?
She did. She's been taken to safety.
Evangeline breathed a sigh of relief. One less thing to worry about then.
I should have been here. If something had happened to Justinia when I was gone, I never would have forgiven myself. Thank you.
You are welcome.
Her Eminence is extremely grateful as well. If there is anything you need.
Evangeline nodded, but couldn't bring herself to do more. Satisfied, Leliana squeezed her shoulder and then left. Already more Templars were arriving. Order was being restored. Taking a deep breath, she got to her feet and straightened her armor. Despite the healing magic, it still felt as if her bones were covered in bruises, and her lungs were filled with soot.
Magic can't do everything,
she reminded herself.